Welcome back. We've walked through 60 million years. We've seen civilizations rise and fall. We've watched the Emperor unite humanity, only to be betrayed by the son he loved most. We've traced 10,000 years of slow decay, as the Imperium transformed from a secular dream into a theocratic nightmare that survives through faith and fear. Tonight, we reach the end, or perhaps the beginning of the end. We're going to witness the event that broke the galaxy in half. The moment when everything the Imperium had been holding back finally burst through. When the 13th time became the charm for the forces of chaos. When a fortress world that had stood for 10 millennia finally fell. This is the story of Cadia's last stand, of a Primarch who slept for 10,000 years and woke to horror, of a galaxy split by a wound that will never heal, of humanity's desperate final gambit to survive one more day in a universe that's decided it's time for us to die. This is M42, the age of the Dark Imperium, the era when the lights went out and the monsters came flooding in. So settle in one last time. The night is at its darkest, and we're about to learn what happens when the fortress finally falls. Let me tell you about the Great Rift and what came after. For 10,000 years, Abaddon the Despoiler had been trying to finish what Horus started. He was the War Master's successor. Not by inheritance, Horus had no heirs, but by force of will and accumulated power. Abaddon had taken the shattered remnants of the Sons of Horus, renamed them the Black Legion, and spent 10 millennia building them into the premier Chaos Space Marine warband in the galaxy. 12 times he'd launched Black Crusades from the Eye of Terror. Massive invasions aimed at the heart of Imperial space. 12 times he'd been pushed back. Not defeated entirely. Each crusade accomplished something, weakened the Imperium in some way, but never achieving the ultimate goal: destroying Cadia. Cadia, the fortress world that stood at the mouth of the Eye of Terror like a cork in a bottle. Its surface was covered in fortifications, its population born soldiers. Every Cadian child learned to field strip a lasgun before they learned to read. They had a saying, "Cadia stands." Not Cadia will stand, or Cadia must stand. Just Cadia stands. Present tense, eternal, unchangeable. The planet was protected by ancient technology. Pylons, blackstone structures left over from the Necrons' war against the Old Ones. These pylons stabilized reality, made warp incursions difficult, limited Chaos's ability to manifest on Cadia's surface. As long as the pylons stood, Cadia could hold. Abaddon had tried to destroy them before. Failed. The pylons were nearly indestructible. Ancient Necron engineering that the Imperium barely understood and couldn't replicate. Destroying enough of them to matter required resources he'd never possessed. Until now. The 13th Black Crusade was different. Abaddon had spent centuries planning it, gathering allies, making pacts with demon princes and chaos gods, accumulating resources on a scale that dwarfed his previous attempts. He'd learned patience from his failures. This time, he wouldn't rush. This time, he would be thorough. He needed 3 things: an army large enough to overwhelm Cadia's defenders, weapons powerful enough to destroy the pylons, and a distraction that would split the Imperium's response. He got all 3. The 13th Black Crusade began not with Abaddon's forces, but with strange events across the galaxy. Unrelated incidents that, in hindsight, were the first dominoes falling. On Macragge, Roboute Guilliman's stasis field began to flicker. The Primarch had been in suspended animation for 10,000 years, preserved but not alive, poisoned by a demon blade that kept him hovering between death and healing. Tech priests had tried to reverse it. Failed. Accepted that Guilliman would sleep forever, or until the Emperor himself could heal him, which meant forever. But the field was flickering, weakening. Something was changing. In the webway, the Eldar were moving. Not just the craft world Aeldari, but the Harlequins, mysterious followers of the Laughing God, who moved between all Aeldari factions. They were gathering artifacts, assembling something, following prophecies that spoke of Ined, the nascent god of the dead that the Aeldari had been cultivating for millennia. The Inari emerged. A new faction of Aeldari, led by a figure called Ivrain, who claimed to be Ined's prophet. They believed they could awaken their god of death fully, use him to destroy Slaanesh, free all Aeldari souls from "she who thirsts' hunger." It was desperate, radical, and it required collecting 5 Kronzords, ancient blades scattered across the galaxy, one of which was in Slaanesh's own palace in the Warp. Meanwhile, Belisarius Cawl, an archmagos of the Mechanicus, who'd been alive since the heresy, revealed he'd been working on a secret project for 10,000 years. Under orders from Guilliman himself, given before the Primarch's wounding. Cawl had been improving the Space Marine gene seed, creating a new generation of Astartes, Primaris Marines, larger, stronger, more resilient, and stored in stasis, waiting for the order to deploy them. These events seemed unrelated, random, but they were converging. The Eldar needed Cawl's technology to perform a ritual. Cawl needed the Eldar's knowledge to complete his work, and both needed Guilliman, because only a Primarch had the authority to deploy the Primaris Marines without triggering civil war within the Imperium. The pieces were moving, but the center of everything was still Cadia. 999 year M41, the last year of the 41st millennium. Abaddon's forces emerged from the Eye of Terror in numbers that eclipsed anything he'd brought before. His fleet darkened the void. Billions of cultists, tens of thousands of Chaos Space Marines, Daemon engines, Titans twisted by the Warp, and at his command, something that should not have existed. The black stone fortresses. These were ancient stations, massive beyond comprehension. Built by the Old Ones or the Necrons, no one was sure, and capable of manipulating the warp on a fundamental level. The Imperium had controlled several, lost them during various conflicts. Abaddon had been quietly gathering them for millennia, turning them into weapons. He brought 2 black stone fortresses to Cadia, and he aimed them at the pylons. The Imperium responded with everything. Space Marine chapters from across the galaxy converged on Cadia. The Imperial Guard sent millions of troops. The Imperial Navy deployed entire battle fleets. This was the battle, the one that would determine whether the 42nd millennium would even happen. Saint Celestine manifested. A living saint, one of the most powerful the Imperium had ever produced. She led the defenders from the front. Where she fought, faith became literal power. Miracles occurred. Soldiers who should have died kept fighting. Weapons that should have failed kept firing. But Abaddon was patient. He didn't try to conquer Cadia through ground assault. He just kept hammering at the pylons, using the black stone fortresses like massive siege weapons. Each shot destroyed another pylon. Each destruction weakened reality on Cadia a little more. The defenders held the fortresses, repelled wave after wave of chaos forces. The fighting lasted for months, years from certain perspectives. Time on Cadia was becoming unstable as the pylons fell. Soldiers fought battles that seemed to take days, only to emerge and find weeks had passed. Or the opposite. Time was breaking. The Imperium knew they were losing, but they kept fighting, because that's what Cadians did. They stood, even when standing was futile, even when the end was inevitable. They stood because Cadia stood. It was their identity, their purpose, their faith. Abaddon destroyed the last pylon, and reality on Cadia collapsed. The warp flooded in. Demons manifested en masse. The ground itself began to twist. Buildings bent into impossible shapes. The sky turned colors that shouldn't exist. Soldiers' flesh began mutating. Those with the weakest wills were possessed immediately. Those with stronger wills just went mad. The order came from the Planetary Defense Command. Evacuate. Cadia is lost. Get as many people off-world as possible. Leave the dead. Leave the dying. Just get anyone who can still fight onto ships and run. And then Abaddon did something that proved he'd learned from Horus's mistakes. Horus had hesitated, had drawn out the siege of Terra, given the Loyalists time to respond. Abaddon wouldn't make that error. If Cadia wouldn't surrender, if its people wouldn't break. He rammed a black stone fortress into the planet. The impact was apocalyptic. Tectonic plates shattered. Oceans vaporized. The atmosphere ignited. Cadia, the fortress, world that had stood for 10,000 years, that had weathered 13 Black Crusades, that had been the Imperium's unbreakable shield, broke. The planet shattered. Not completely destroyed, enough remained that the core was intact, the debris field massive. But Cadia as a world, as a functioning planet, as home to billions, gone. The Cadian survivors, those who'd made it to the evacuation ships, watched their homeworld die from orbit. They couldn't process it, couldn't accept it. The thing that couldn't happen had happened. The impossible was real. A Cadian general, Lord Castellan Ursarkar Creed, spoke the words that would define them forever after. The planet broke before the guard did. It wasn't boast, it was denial, trauma. The only way to frame what had happened that allowed them to keep existing. Cadia was gone, but Cadians remained. And as long as Cadians lived, Cadia stood. In their hearts, in their discipline, in the way they fought. It would have to be enough. Because the planet itself was rubble. Cadia's destruction was the capstone, the final piece of a ritual that had been building for 10,000 years. Every Black Crusade hadn't been a failed attempt to conquer Terra. They'd been steps in a process, weakening reality, creating cracks in the barriers between the warp and real space, building toward this moment. Abaddon hadn't been trying to win. He'd been trying to break the galaxy. And he succeeded. The Cicatrix Maledictum opened. The Great Rift. A wound in reality that stretched from one end of the galaxy to the other. Like the Eye of Terror, but vastly larger. A scar across the stars where the warp bled through into real space. Where demons could manifest. Where time and physics stopped following consistent rules. The rift split the galaxy in half. On one side, Imperium Sanctus, the Emperor's light, could still reach. The Astronomicon still functioned. Relatively normal space, or as normal as the 41st millennium ever was. On the other side, Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium, cut off from Terra's light. The Astronomicon invisible, or so dim it was useless, navigation nearly impossible, communication with the rest of the Imperium severed. Millions of worlds suddenly isolated. Alone, surrounded by warp storms and demonic incursions. The Noctis Eterna. The blackness. That's what they called the period immediately after the rift opened. Warp storms so intense that travel was impossible anywhere in the galaxy. Worlds were isolated not for days or months, but for years. Some experienced decades or centuries of isolation, while the rest of the galaxy experienced only months. Time broke. Completely. Fleets that left port in 999 arrived at destinations in 202, or 10M42, or didn't arrive at all. Ships translated into the warp and never came out. Worlds that thought they'd been isolated for years discovered only weeks had passed. Others experienced the opposite. What felt like days turned out to be years. The Imperium, which had barely held together through bureaucracy and faith, lost even that. Every world was on its own. Every system had to survive without support, without reinforcement, without hope that help was coming. Because help couldn't come. The warp was too violent, the storms too intense, the galaxy had been broken, and no one knew if it could ever be fixed. On Macragge, the Inari arrived. Yvraine, prophet of Inead, with her retinue of Aeldari from every faction. They came with purpose, with knowledge, with the power of their nascent god of death channeled through the crone zords they'd gathered. Most of them, at least. Enough. Belisarius' call was already there. The ancient Arch Megos had been waiting for this moment. He knew what the Eldar intended. Knew they could do what the Mechanicus couldn't. Knew that resurrecting Roboute Guilliman was worth the price of working with Xenos. It was heresy. Absolutely, undeniably heresy. The Inquisition would have executed everyone involved if they'd known. But Khal had spent 10,000 years preparing for this. He'd hidden his Primaris project, hidden his communications with Guilliman before the Primarch's wounding, hidden everything that mattered. He'd learned something fundamental about the Imperium. If you had results, you could get away with anything. Yvraine performed the ritual, called on Inead's power, the god of the dead, still not fully awakened but conscious enough to act through his prophet. She plunged a crone zord into Guilliman's chest. Not to kill, but to heal. To cut away the corruption. To sever the threads of Nurgle's rot that had kept the Primarch trapped between life and death. The stasis field shattered. Guilliman convulsed. Drew breath for the first time in 10,000 years. Opened his eyes, and the first thing he saw was Xenos. Eldar, standing over him, having just stabbed him with a sword. His hand went to his weapon. Instinct. Training. The recognition that aliens were never to be trusted. But Khal was there, speaking quickly, explaining. Guilliman was a Primarch, but he was also a strategist. He understood necessity, understood that if these Xenos had wanted him dead, he'd be dead. That they'd saved him meant they wanted something. Everything could be negotiated. That was politics. And Guilliman had always been the best at politics. Yvraine explained. The galaxy had broken. The Imperium was dying. They needed him. Humanity needed him. And the Inari needed humanity to survive long enough for them to complete their own mission, fully awakening Inead and destroying Slaanesh. Temporary alliance, common enemy. The math was simple. Guilliman agreed. On one condition. Show me what's happened. Tell me everything. They did, and it broke something in him. Imagine sleeping for 10,000 years. You fall asleep in the 31st millennium. The Imperium is wounded but intact. Your brothers are alive, most of them. Your father is on the Golden Throne, but it's temporary. A situation that will be resolved. The dream of a secular, rational empire is damaged by the heresy, but salvageable. You wake in the 42nd millennium. Your father is still on the golden throne, not temporarily, forever. A corpse sustained by machines and psychic force, worshipped as a god by trillions who've never questioned whether he wanted that worship. Your brothers are gone, dead or disappeared or turned traitor. You're alone, the last loyal son in a galaxy that's moved on without you. The Imperium you built has become everything your father tried to prevent. It's theocratic, faith-based, oppressive in ways that make the tyrants you overthrew during the Great Crusade look merciful. Innovation is heresy. Progress is forbidden. The entire society runs on accumulated ritual and the daily sacrifice of millions. Half the galaxy is on fire, cut off, drowning in darkness, the other half barely holding on, and everyone expects you to fix it. Guilliman walked through the fortress of Hera, the Ultramarines' fortress monastery on Macraga. It had been his home once. Now, it was a shrine. To him. His armor, his weapons, his personal effects, all treated as holy relics. His writings studied like scripture. His image worshipped. The Space Marines he met weren't his sons. They were genetic descendants, yes, but they didn't know him. They knew the legend, the Primarch who'd written the Codex, the demigod who'd saved the Imperium. They knelt before him like he was divine. He told them to stand, to stop treating him like a god. He was just a man. A very large, very old, very genetically enhanced man, but still just a man. They didn't understand. To them, the Primarchs were myths. Beings from a golden age that existed only in stories. Having one standing in front of them, speaking to them, was miracle made flesh. Guilliman met with the Ultramarines' chapter master, Marneus Calgar, a legend in his own right, a warrior who'd earned his position through centuries of service. And Calgar looked at Guilliman with something approaching awe. It was wrong. All wrong. These weren't soldiers serving the Imperium. They were worshippers serving a religion, and he was one of their gods. Guilliman demanded records, access to the Imperial archives. He needed to understand what had happened, how the Imperium had fallen so far, what decisions had led to this nightmare. He read. For days, weeks, absorbing 10,000 years of history compressed into reports and analyses. He saw the wars, the crusades, the internal conflicts, the slow transformation of the imperial truth into the imperial cult, the rise of the ecclesiarchy, the age of apostasy. The endless compromises that turned his father's dream into a theocratic tyranny. And he understood. This wasn't malice. This wasn't corruption, not in the traditional sense. This was survival. Every terrible decision made sense in context. Every compromise was necessary to prevent something worse. The Imperium had become what it was because the alternatives were extinction. That didn't make it less horrifying, just more tragic. Guilliman faced a choice. Reject the Imperium as it was. Try to reform it back into something approximating the Great Crusade's vision. That would trigger civil war. Split the Space Marines. Possibly destroy everything. Or accept it. Work within the system. Use the faith that he despised as a tool to mobilize the Imperium's defenders. Become the leader they needed, even if it meant betraying everything he believed in. He chose pragmatism. The same pragmatism that had led him to write the Codex Astartes. The same practicality that made him the Imperium's greatest administrator. He would save the Imperium, even if the Imperium he saved was unrecognizable, even if it meant becoming complicit in horrors he'd once have fought to prevent, even if it meant accepting worship he didn't want from people who saw him as divine. Because the alternative was letting humanity die. And Guilliman, for all his disgust, for all his horror at what his father's empire had become, he was still loyal, still devoted to humanity's survival, still a Primarch. He would do his duty. Even if his duty now meant leading a crusade for a religion he despised in service to an empire that betrayed everything he believed in. Guilliman couldn't just declare himself ruler. He needed legitimacy, needed the authority that could only come from Terra, from the High Lords, from standing in the Emperor's presence and receiving whatever blessing or command the God Emperor could still communicate. So he had to cross a galaxy that was literally split in half, had to navigate through warp storms that were destroying ships by the hundreds, had to fight through demon incursions and heretic fleets, and all the normal hazards of space travel multiplied by the Cicatrix Maledictum. The journey was called the Terran Crusade. Guilliman's fleet, accompanied by the Inari and protected by Call's technology, fought its way across the galaxy. Every system they passed through was under siege, demons manifesting, chaos cults rising. The Noctis Aeterna was at its height. Darkness was everywhere. Guilliman did what he could. Deployed Space Marines to threatened worlds, left garrisons, provided what support was possible. But he couldn't save everyone. Couldn't stop everywhere. The galaxy was too big, the threats too numerous. He had to reach Terra. Everything else was secondary. They fought the Death Guard. Mortarian's Plague Marines had followed Guilliman across the galaxy, seeking to finish what had started on Calth 10,000 years before. Brother against brother. Primarch against Primarch. The fight was brutal, horrifying. Mortarian was a demon now, empowered by Nurgle, wielding gifts that made him nearly invincible. Guilliman won. Barely. He banished Mortarian back to the warp. But the victory cost him. His armor was corroded, his body infected with plagues that should have killed him. Only his Primarch physiology kept him alive. That, and sheer stubborn refusal to die before reaching Terra. The fleet arrived at Sol, fought through the defenses, because even with Guilliman's identity verified, protocol required that any fleet approaching Terra be challenged. The Imperium's paranoia was absolute. No exceptions. Not even for Primarchs. Guilliman stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked at Terra through the viewport. His father's throne world. The center of the Imperium. The heart of everything. It was a hive world now. The entire planet covered in cities stacked miles high. The oceans gone, paved over. The forests extinct. Natural beauty erased in favor of function. It was efficient, practical, exactly what you'd expect from an empire that had been surviving for 10,000 years. It was also dead. A tomb covered in living corpses. Guilliman descended to the surface. To the Imperial Palace. The structure had grown over 10 millennia. What had been vast in M30 was incomprehensibly massive now. Wings and towers and sections added by generation after generation of faithful builders. It wasn't one building. It was a city-sized complex that held the government of 1,000,000 worlds. He passed through security that would have killed any normal person. Gene scanners, psychic probes, physical barriers that required him to prove his identity a dozen different ways. The Custodes met him. The Golden Guardians who hadn't left the palace in millennia. They knew him immediately, knelt, rose, led him deeper into the palace complex without a word. To the Sanctum Imperialis, the Emperor's throne room. Guilliman stood before the golden throne and looked at what his father had become. We don't know what passed between them. The conversation is recorded, witnessed by the Custodes and select members of the Adeptus Terra, but Guilliman has never spoken about it publicly. What little leaks through suggests it was not what anyone expected. Guilliman approached the golden throne. His father sat there, barely alive. A desiccated corpse sustained by machines that were themselves barely functional. Psychic power radiated from him in waves that made even a Primarch's soul ache. The Emperor was present, conscious, aware, but he wasn't human anymore. If he ever had been. Guilliman spoke. About the galaxy, about the Imperium, about the choices he'd have to make. Asking for guidance, for wisdom, for the Father's blessing that would give him authority to do what needed doing. The Emperor responded. Not in words, in pure psychic communication. Thought to thought, mind to mind, unfiltered by language or metaphor. And what Guilliman experienced broke something in him. He'd always known his father was inhuman, but he'd believed there was humanity beneath the power. That the Emperor, despite his might, still felt as mortals felt. Still cared as fathers care. Still saw his sons as sons rather than tools. The communication from the Emperor suggested otherwise. There was no warmth, no fatherly love, no recognition of Guilliman as anything more than a useful instrument. The Emperor needed Guilliman to save the Imperium, needed him to lead humanity through the crisis, but the emotional connection, the personal relationship, the thing that made them father and son, rather than creator and creation. Absent. Maybe it had always been absent. Maybe 10,000 years on the Golden Throne had burned it away. Or maybe, and this was the thought that Guilliman couldn't shake, it had never existed in the first place. He'd been created for a purpose. The Primarchs were tools, carefully crafted to serve specific functions. Horus's betrayal had hurt the Emperor not because a beloved son had fallen, but because a valuable asset had been corrupted. The grief wasn't personal. It was tactical. At least, that's how Guilliman interpreted what he experienced. The custodes who witnessed it describe it differently. They say the Emperor's love for Guilliman was obvious, that Guilliman simply couldn't perceive it through the psychic noise and the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated divinity. Maybe both interpretations are true. Maybe the Emperor loves his sons, but the love of a god is so different from human affection that it reads as coldness. Maybe Guilliman's trauma and disillusionment colored his perception. Maybe the Emperor was trying to communicate something else entirely, and it was misunderstood. We'll never know. Guilliman won't speak of it. The Emperor can't clarify. What we know is that Guilliman emerged from the throne room, changed. Granted the title of Lord Commander of the Imperium, given authority over all Imperial military forces. The de facto ruler of the Imperium in the Emperor's name. He accepted the role, the burden, the terrible responsibility of trying to save a broken empire. But he did it with the knowledge, or the belief, that his father saw him as a tool rather than a son. That everything he was about to do would be in service to a being who might not actually care whether he lived or died beyond the utility he provided. It was the loneliest position in the galaxy, the most powerful and the most isolated. And Guilliman took it because someone had to, because the alternative was watching humanity burn. That's duty, not glory, not honor, just the cold recognition that the job needs doing, and you're the only one who can do it. So you do it, even if it destroys you, even if the being you're serving doesn't love you, even if everything you're fighting for became something you despise. You do it because that's what it means to be a Primarch, to be a leader, to be human in the best and worst senses of that word. Guilliman took command, and the Indomitus Crusade began. The first thing Guilliman did was deploy Belisarius Caul's secret project. The Primaris Marines, after 10,000 years of development, refinement, and preparation, the new generation of Space Marines was ready. The revelation was catastrophic. Every Space Marine chapter learned that there had been a secret project to improve them, that their gene seed, perfected across 10 millennia, had been deemed inadequate, that someone, Caul, a tech priest, not even an Astartes, had been tinkering with the Emperor's work. Some chapters accepted immediately. The Ultramarines, loyal to Guilliman, integrated the Primaris without question. Other Codex-compliant chapters followed suit. The new Marines were better, stronger, more resilient. The tactical advantages were undeniable. Other chapters resisted. The Space Wolves saw it as insult. Their gene seed was unique, specifically tailored to Fenris and the Canis helix. Having improved versions suggested the original was flawed. The Dark Angels were suspicious. How much did Call know about gene seed modification? Had he discovered their secrets? The Black Templars rejected Primaris entirely at first. They'd never followed the Codex. Why start now? But Guilliman had authority. Primarch authority. He wasn't asking. He was commanding. And slowly, grudgingly, most chapters accepted at least some Primaris reinforcements. The Primaris themselves were strange. They'd been created in batches over 10,000 years. Some had been in stasis for millennia. Others were newly created. They had no chapter culture, no traditions, no bonds forged through shared combat. They were fresh, untested, and they'd been indoctrinated with an idealized vision of the Imperium that didn't match reality. Imagine being told you were created to serve the Imperium, to fight for humanity. You're put in stasis. You wake up, and the Imperium is a theocratic nightmare. The brothers you're supposed to fight alongside look at you with suspicion. The wars you're supposed to win are unwinnable. The glory you expected is just grinding survival. The Primaris Marines adapted. Had to. But the integration was rough. Traditionalist Space Marines resented them. Primaris felt isolated. Some tried to prove themselves through excessive valor. Others became disillusioned. The unnumbered suns, they called the first wave. Gray shields. Marines who wore gray armor because they hadn't been assigned to chapters yet. They fought in the Indomitus Crusade not as Ultramarines or Imperial Fists or Blood Angels, but as generic Astartes. Tools deployed where needed. Only after proving themselves would they earn chapter colors, chapter identity, chapter brotherhood. It was a compromise, a way to deploy new strength without forcing instant integration. And it worked, mostly. The Primaris proved themselves in battle, died in the same wars as traditional Marines, bled the same blood for the same emperor. Over time, suspicion faded. Mostly. Some chapters fully integrated Primaris. Others kept them separate. Still others created entirely new chapters from Primaris stock. Ultima Founding, it was called. Biggest, largest founding since the Second. Hundreds of new chapters. All Primaris, all owing their existence to Guilliman. It shifted the balance of power among Space Marines, made Guilliman's influence undeniable, created a force loyal to him personally in ways that transcended chapter allegiances. Some saw this as necessary, others as worrying. A Primarch with his own legion in all but name, and the willingness to use them. But in M42, with the galaxy burning, Those concerns were secondary. The Primaris could fight. That's all that mattered. Guilliman couldn't stay on Terra. The Dark Imperium needed him. Imperium Nihilus was cut off, drowning in darkness. He had to lead relief efforts, re-establish communication, bring the Astronomican's light back to worlds that had lost it. But first, he had to deal with Mortarion. His brother had followed him. The Death Guard and their demonic allies had established plague gardens across Ultramar. Guilliman's own realm, the 500 worlds he'd personally governed before the heresy, was infected. Nurgle's rot spread across planets that had been models of imperial civilization. Mortarion wanted to corrupt his brother, turn him, prove that even the perfect Primarch, the loyal son, could fall to chaos if pushed hard enough. And he had 10,000 years of bitterness driving him. 10,000 years of being the Emperor's tool, used and discarded. Guilliman had gotten the glory, the recognition, the love that Mortarion had been denied. Now Mortarion would take everything from his brother, would prove that perfection was weakness, that decay was inevitable, that Grandfather Nurgle's embrace was superior to the Emperor's cold demands. The plague wars lasted for over a century. From a certain perspective, time in Ultramar was broken. Some worlds experienced years of fighting, while others experienced only weeks. The warp storms made normal causality meaningless. Guilliman fought with everything: the Ultramarines, the Primaris, the full might of the Indomitus Crusade fleet. But Mortarion was a demon Primarch now, effectively immortal. Kill him, and he'd just reform in the warp. Come back stronger, learning from defeats. The fighting was brutal. Plagues that could kill space marines. Demons that could corrupt even the most faithful. Entire worlds that had to be quarantined and left to rot because cleansing them was impossible. The Death Guard didn't care about casualties, didn't care about retreat. They were already dead in every way that mattered. They'd fight forever if necessary. Guilliman had advantages: his tactical genius, his ability to coordinate across multiple fronts, the resources of the Imperium finally responding, slowly, to his commands. But Mortarion had time, had patience, had the backing of a chaos god who would sustain him indefinitely. The turning point came when Guilliman received a weapon: the Emperor's sword, a blade that had hung on the wall of the Imperial Palace for 10,000 years, a relic of the Emperor himself. When Guilliman held it, it ignited with golden flame, the Emperor's power channeled through his son, the weapon of a god. Guilliman and Mortarion fought in single combat. Primarch against Primarch, one wielding the Emperor's flame, the other empowered by Nurgle's rot. The duel was apocal continu iptic. Reality itself bent around their clash. Where Guilliman struck, the plagues withered. Where Mortarion's scythe fell, decay spread. They were no longer just brothers fighting. They were ideologies made flesh. Order versus entropy. Imperial tyranny versus chaos corruption. Neither good, both terrible, locked in combat because the alternative was submission. Guilliman won. The Emperor's sword cut through Mortarion's defenses. The golden flame burned away the demonic essence that sustained him. Mortarion's body dissolved, banished back to the warp. His last words were not curses or threats, but something almost pitying. You've become Father's tool. Just like he always wanted. At least I chose my chains. Then he was gone. The Death Guard retreated. The plagues began to recede. Slowly, because Nurgle's gifts never truly leave. Ultramar was saved. Scarred, diminished, but saved. Guilliman stood in the aftermath, holding a sword that burned with his father's power, and wondered if Mortarion was right. If he'd traded one form of servitude for another. If his loyalty was nobility, or just the inability to imagine another path. He didn't have time for the answer. The Indomitus Crusade was waiting. Imperium Nihilus was waiting. Billions of humans were waiting for the salvation that only a Primarch could provide. So he put the questions aside, shelved his doubts, and did what Primarchs do. He led. He fought. He saved what could be saved and mourned what couldn't. Because that's all that was left. All that had ever been left. Duty without hope. Service without gratitude. Victory that looked like survival, and survival that felt like defeat. With Ultramar secured, Guilliman launched the full Indomitus Crusade. Not just one fleet, but dozens, hundreds, a military mobilization on a scale not seen since the Great Crusade itself. Every fleet aimed at Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium. The half of the galaxy cut off from Terra's light. The goal was simple. Re-establish contact. Bring relief. Show the isolated worlds that they hadn't been forgotten. That the Imperium endured. That help, however late, had finally arrived. The execution was anything but simple. The cicatrix maledictum was a wound that wouldn't close. Crossing it meant navigating through literal hell. Warp storms that could tear ships apart. Demons that manifested in real space. Time distortions that meant you might arrive decades before you left, or centuries after you should have. Guilliman couldn't cross it directly. No one could. Instead, the Crusade fleets found weak points, places where the barrier was thinner, where the warp and reality didn't completely overlap. The Nachmund Gauntlet became the primary route, a narrow corridor of relatively stable space that connected Imperium Sanctus and Imperium Nihilus. Relatively stable meant only moderately lethal. Ships were still lost, entire fleets sometimes, but it was navigable. Barely. The Crusade fleets that made it through found horror. Imperium Nihilus had been drowning in the Noctis Aeterna for years, decades from some perspectives. Worlds had fallen to chaos, to Xenos invasion, to simple starvation when trade routes collapsed. Some had survived through measures that would have been declared heretical if anyone from Imperium Sanctus had witnessed them. Deals with Xenos, use of technology that bordered on AI, desperate compromises that had kept populations alive but violated every imperial doctrine. Guilliman made hard choices. Some worlds, despite their heresy, were reintegrated because they'd survived, because they still considered themselves imperial, because the alternative was admitting they should have died for their principles, and Guilliman was pragmatic enough to value survival over doctrinal purity. Other worlds had fallen too far, been too corrupted, or simply couldn't be saved with the resources available. Those received exterminatus, orbital bombardment that sterilized the surface. Billions killed to prevent billions more from falling to the same corruption. It was the calculus of the Imperium, the same mathematics that had governed 10,000 years of survival. How many can we save versus how many will that cost? When does rescue become enabling corruption? When does mercy become weakness? Guilliman hated it. Every decision, every world abandoned, every population written off as acceptable losses. But he made the decisions anyway, because someone had to. Because the alternative was paralysis, and paralysis meant death for everyone. The crusade spread across Imperium Nihilus, fleet by fleet, system by system. They couldn't save everyone, couldn't reach every threatened world. But they could show that the Imperium still existed, still fought, still cared in its distant bureaucratic way about the subjects it ruled. And slowly, communication was re-established. Not everywhere. The Cicatrix Maledictum still cut the galaxy in half. But through the Nachmund Gauntlet, through other weak points, through astropaths broadcasting with renewed strength, the two halves of the Imperium could talk again. Imperium Nihilus wouldn't be reconquered. Not fully. Too much had been lost. Too many worlds had fallen or been corrupted beyond saving. But it would endure. Isolated sectors would form their own mini-imperiums, their own alliances, their own survival strategies. And Guilliman would accept it, because the alternative was letting them all die. And that was a price he wouldn't pay. Not yet. Not while he still had strength to fight. While Guilliman waged his crusade, something else was happening across the galaxy. Something that would have terrified the Emperor if he could still express terror. Human psychers were manifesting at unprecedented rates. Not just more frequently, but more powerfully. Children born with abilities that would have made them sanctioned psychers in M41 were now manifesting gifts that rivaled librarians. Adults who'd lived their entire lives psychically dormant suddenly developed powers overnight. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica was overwhelmed. The black ships couldn't keep up, couldn't collect all the new psychers, couldn't screen them all for corruption, couldn't provide training fast enough. Unsanctioned psychers were everywhere. Some lost control and became gateways for demons. Entire cities were consumed by daimonic incursions that started with a single untrained psyker reaching into the warp for help. Others learned control on their own, developed their own techniques, created networks of rogue psychers who helped each other survive outside imperial oversight. The Inquisition declared it a crisis. The Psychic Awakening. A fundamental shift in human evolution that was happening too fast to control. They saw catastrophe. A ticking time bomb that would explode across every world simultaneously. But there were benefits, too. The Astronomicon burned brighter. More psychers meant more fuel, yes, but also more power being channeled. The beacon could reach further, penetrate deeper into Imperium Nihilus. Some astropaths could now communicate across distances that would have been impossible before. Military psychers could accomplish feats that had been beyond their capabilities. The Grey Knights recruited more aggressively. Other chapters re-established their Librarius programs with renewed focus. The Inquisition trained more sanctioned psychers, even while executing the unsanctioned ones by the thousands. And theories emerged. This wasn't random. This was the Imperium evolving, responding to the threat of the Cicatrix Maledictum by developing the one weapon that could oppose it. Psychic power to fight psychic corruption. The Emperor's will made manifest in a new generation of defenders. Or it was humanity's death throes, the last desperate mutation of a dying species. The warp consuming us from within as it had consumed so many species before. The final proof that the Emperor's Great Crusade had failed, and humanity was doomed to become either extinct or transformed into something no longer recognizably human. Both interpretations were probably correct. Both contained truth. The Psychic Awakening was evolution and extinction simultaneously, salvation and damnation, hope and horror. Which one would predominate depended entirely on whether humanity could survive long enough to see the outcome. And in M42, survival itself was becoming increasingly uncertain. So here we are, the 42nd millennium, the current era, the age of the Dark Imperium. Let's assess what remains. The Imperium is split in half. Imperium Sanctus contains Terra, Mars, most of the historically important worlds. The Astronomicon can be seen. Navigation is difficult, but possible. Communication functions slowly. This is the better half, relatively speaking. Imperium Nihilus is dark. The Astronomicon is invisible, or so dim it's useless. Worlds are isolated or connected through precarious routes that could close at any moment. Some sectors have organized into regional governments, mini-imperiums that govern themselves because Terra is unreachable. Others have descended into anarchy, warlordism, or worse. The Cicatrix Maledictum separates them. A wound in reality that will never fully heal. Crossing it is possible through specific routes, but those routes are contested, fought over, constantly under threat from chaos forces that want to sever even those tenuous connections. The Indomitus Crusade has re-established contact with many worlds in Imperium Nihilus. But contact isn't control, isn't security. It's just acknowledgement that both sides still exist, that neither has been completely consumed, yet. Guilliman governs as Lord Commander, but he can't be everywhere, can't personally oversee 1,000,000 worlds, so he delegates, empowers regional authorities, trusts them to make decisions he would make, hopes they won't abuse that trust. Most don't. Most are loyal, competent, doing their best in impossible circumstances. Some become tyrants, using their newfound authority to build personal empires. Some fall to chaos, the corruption subtle at first, but growing. Some simply fail, overwhelmed by threats they can't handle. The Imperium that emerges from the Indomitus Crusade is more feudal than it's been in millennia, more reliant on local power structures, less unified, but also more resilient in a way. When one sector falls, it doesn't drag down the rest. When one governor becomes corrupt, it doesn't poison the entire administration. It's the Imperium acknowledging what's always been true. Terra's authority is theoretical in regions it can't reach. Better to formalize that reality than maintain the fiction of centralized control. The Nachmund Gauntlet is the primary stable route between Imperium Sanctus and Nihilus. Stable is relative. It's still a narrow corridor through warp-infested space, still contested by every force that wants to control transit between the two halves of the galaxy. The Imperium fortifies it heavily. Space Marine chapters are assigned to guard its endpoints. Imperial Navy battle groups patrol its length. Entire sectors organize their defenses around maintaining access to the gauntlet. Because if it closes, Imperium Nihilus is truly lost, cut off completely, left to survive on its own without any hope of reinforcement or support from Terra. The Chaos forces know this. They attack the gauntlet constantly. Not trying to destroy it. They can't. It's a feature of the warp itself. But trying to make it impassable. Seeding it with warp storms. Manifesting demon fleets at key points. Corrupting the systems nearby so that even approaching the gauntlet becomes suicidal. The Death Guard are particularly active here. Plague fleets that don't need supplies or morale. That can siege a system for decades without concern. That spread disease through void combat, infecting ships and crews with rot that can't be cleansed. The fighting never stops. Every convoy needs escorts. Every military deployment is a gamble. Ships are lost regularly. Some arrive centuries late due to warp distortions. Others never arrive at all. But the gauntlet remains open, because both sides need it, The Imperium needs to reach Nihilus. Chaos needs access to Sanctus. Neither can afford to completely destroy what they're fighting over. It's a stalemate. A grinding attritional conflict with no end in sight. Just another front in the eternal war. Another place where millions die so that billions might live. The Imperium isn't alone in its suffering. The Aeldari are unified in ways they haven't been since the fall. The Inari movement, the awakening of Inead, has created the first cooperation between craft worlds, Drukhari, and Exodites in 10,000 years. It's fragile, tentative, but it exists. They still raid the Imperium, still see humanity as Monkey, barely evolved apes. But they also recognize that chaos is the common enemy, that the cicatrix maledictum threatens them as much as humans, that Slaanesh's continued existence is unacceptable. Some craft worlds work with Guilliman. Provide intelligence, share resources. Not out of trust, but pragmatism. The Inari in particular see the Primarch as a useful tool, someone whose goals align with theirs temporarily, someone who can be manipulated toward mutual benefit. Other Aeldari remain hostile. The Drukhari still need to torture souls to survive. The Harlequins pursue their own mysterious agenda. The Exodites isolate themselves and kill anyone who intrudes on their worlds. The Necrons are awakening. Faster now. The cicatrix maledictum's opening has disrupted their tomb worlds. Woken dynasties earlier than their chronometers intended. They emerge to find the galaxy changed beyond recognition. Some want to reclaim it, drive out the younger species, and restore the Necron Empire to its ancient glory. They see humanity as vermin infesting their property. The Silent King leads these efforts, though even he struggles to unite the fractious dynasties. Others have different goals. The Destroyer cults want to end all life, turn the galaxy into lifeless metal and stone. Some cryptechs pursue scientific research that makes the Mechanicus look tame. Some overlords just want their territories back and don't care what happens beyond their borders. The Necrons are powerful, individually and collectively, but they're also fragmented. Each dynasty independent, each overlord pursuing their own agenda. They can't organize into a unified threat. Yet, the Orks are having the time of their lives. The galaxy's on fire. There's fighting everywhere. This is the best wag in millennia. Gazgkul Mag Uruk Thraka is still waging the third war for Armageddon. Other Ork war bosses have emerged across the galaxy, creating their own empires, having their own scraps. The Orks don't care about the cicatrix maledictum. It doesn't affect them like it affects other species. They thrive in chaos, grow stronger when conflict intensifies. M42 is their paradise, and they're getting bigger. Reports from multiple fronts suggest orcs are growing to sizes not seen since the War of the Beast. Not Primarch-sized yet, but larger than standard orcs. Smarter. More organized. The Wah energy is building, feeding on the galaxy's violence. If they unify under a single boss, if someone manages to do what the Beast did in M32, the Imperium might not survive it. Not in its current weakened state. The Tyranids keep coming. Hive Fleet Leviathan is the largest yet, still consuming, still adapting, and the main force, the true bulk of the Tyranid swarm, is still outside the galaxy. The Hive fleets that have arrived are scouts, vanguards. When the main swarm arrives, nothing will survive. Not the Imperium, not Chaos, not the Necrons or Eldar. The Tyranids will consume everything organic and starve out everything mechanical through sheer ecological collapse. This is the long-term threat, the existential one. All the other enemies are fighting over who gets to rule the galaxy. The Tyranids don't want to rule. They want to devour. And they're patient. They'll wait for the other factions to weaken each other. Then they'll feed. The Tau Empire continues expanding. Young, optimistic, technologically innovative in ways the Imperium hasn't been in millennia. They offer the greater good. Unity, purpose, equality under their enlightened rule. It's propaganda. The Tau are imperialists like everyone else, but their imperialism is gentler than the Imperium's. Most of the time. And for worlds in Imperium Nihilus that have been abandoned, that are desperate and alone, the Tau's offer seems appealing. The Imperium fights them, declares them Xenos, and therefore subjects for extermination. But the Tau are adaptive, fast learners, and they have something the Imperium doesn't. Hope. The belief that tomorrow can be better than today, that progress is possible. It makes them dangerous in ways the Imperium struggles to counter, because you can't defeat hope with doctrine, can't crush optimism with faith in suffering. Roboute Guilliman sits in the fortress of Hera on Macragge, reviewing reports from across the galaxy. Every day brings news of disasters, worlds lost, fleets destroyed, crusades failed. The Imperium is losing. Slowly, incrementally, but losing. He's working 18-hour days, 20 when necessary. Superhuman physiology means he needs less sleep than mortals. But even a Primarch has limits. Even he can exhaust himself. He's coordinating military operations across half a galaxy, managing resource allocation, arbitrating disputes between High Lords, reforming imperial institutions that have been corrupt for millennia, writing new doctrine to replace 10,000 years of accumulated inefficiency. And he's doing it alone, the only Primarch, The only one with the authority and ability to make decisions at this scale. The only one who remembers what the Imperium was supposed to be. He meets with the Adeptus Custodes, with Inquisitors, with chapter masters and lord generals and planetary governors. All of them want something. Authorization for operations, resources for their theaters, permission to deviate from doctrine, judgment on situations that have no good solutions. He gives them what they need, or what he can spare, or tells them no, and watches them leave angry, knowing they'll resent him but unable to provide what they're asking for because there simply isn't enough to go around. At night, in the brief hours when he allows himself to rest, he reads. The Emperor's works, the Primarch Project notes, everything he can find about his father's intentions, trying to understand what was supposed to happen, what the Emperor was actually trying to achieve. And he finds contradictions, plans within plans, secrets kept even from the Primarchs, evidence that the Emperor knew the heresy was possible, maybe inevitable, that the Webway project was a desperate gamble that had already failed by the time Guilliman was found. The Emperor had been improvising, making the best of a bad situation, trying to save humanity from chaos while simultaneously playing a game against the chaos gods themselves. A game with rules Guilliman didn't understand, and consequences that were still unfolding. His father hadn't been all-knowing, hadn't been infallible, had made mistakes, had gambled and lost. And the Imperium, everything that existed in M42, was built on those failures. The realization is both liberating and crushing. Liberating because it means Guilliman doesn't have to be perfect, doesn't have to live up to an impossible standard. His father wasn't infallible. Why should he be? Crushing because it means no one knows what they're doing. There's no hidden plan, no secret strategy that will save everything if they can just follow it correctly. They're all improvising, making the best of a situation that's been deteriorating for 10,000 years, and Guilliman is expected to fix it, to somehow take this broken empire and make it work, to save 1 billion worlds with resources meant for 1 million, to defeat threats that each individually could destroy the Imperium while they all attack simultaneously. He doesn't know if it's possible, doesn't know if anything he does will matter in the long term, doesn't know if he's prolonging the inevitable or actually achieving something meaningful, but he does it anyway, because the alternative is giving up. And Guilliman was never very good at surrender. The ecclesiarchy adores Guilliman, a living Primarch, a son of the God Emperor returned to lead humanity in its darkest hour. They write new scriptures about him, call him the Avenging Son, the Primarch reborn, the Emperor's sword made flesh. He hates it. Every sermon that praises him as divine is a knife in his side. Every prayer offered in his name feels like mockery. He's not divine. He's just a very old soldier doing his job. But telling people that would undermine the very faith that keeps them fighting. So he accepts it, allows himself to be worshipped, stands in cathedrals while priests sing his glory, lets the ecclesiarchy use his image to inspire the faithful. Because the faith works, it mobilizes populations, turns ordinary humans into weapons, gives people reason to fight when rational analysis says they should surrender. The imperial cult is lies, but it's useful lies. And Guilliman is pragmatic enough to use every tool available, but it costs him. Every day he accepts worship chips away at something inside him. Every prayer offered to him as if he were a god reminds him of what he's become. A figurehead for a religion he despises. A symbol of everything his father tried to prevent. He makes compromises, works with the ecclesiarchy to reform some of its worst excesses, reduces the burden on tithes slightly, improves conditions for Imperial Guard troops where possible, uses his authority to prevent the most egregious abuses. It's not enough. Can never be enough. But it's more than anyone else is doing. More than anyone else can do. And maybe, if he's very lucky and very clever, he can slowly turn the Imperium toward something less horrifying. Won't get back to the Imperial truth. That ship sailed 10,000 years ago. But maybe move toward an ecclesiarchy that's less brutal, less oppressive, that sees citizens as humans rather than tools. It'll take centuries, maybe millennia, and he might not live that long. Even Primarchs can die. But it's the only path forward he can see. The only way to honor his father's original vision while working within the nightmare it's become. He serves a religion he doesn't believe in to save people who don't know he's trying to save them. He accepts worship to preserve the worshippers. He becomes the symbol of faith to protect those who have nothing but faith. It's the ultimate sacrifice for a being raised in the imperial truth. And Guilliman makes it every day. That's the question that haunts M42. After everything we've seen, after 60 million years of civilizations falling, after 10,000 years of decay, after the galaxy literally splitting in half, after every horror we've traced, does hope remain? The honest answer is, barely. The Imperium is losing. Every metric shows it. Territory lost, resources depleted, population declining. The cicatrix maledictum isn't healing. The Tyranids keep coming. Chaos grows stronger. The Necrons wake up. The Orks get bigger. Any one of these threats could destroy the Imperium. All of them together make survival seem impossible. And yet, Guilliman has returned. A Primarch walks among humanity again. The Primaris Marines provide strength the Imperium hasn't had in millennia. Communication has been re-established with Imperium Nihilus. The Astronomicon burns brighter. Small victories, incremental improvements. Nothing that changes the fundamental trajectory. But enough to suggest that maybe humanity can survive one more day. One more year, one more century. Is that hope? Or just denial? The refusal to accept the inevitable? Both, probably. But in a universe as hostile as Warhammer 40,000, stubborn denial might be the only form of hope that's sustainable. The Imperium endures not through optimism or faith in a better future, but through spite, through the simple refusal to die, through billions of people waking up every day and deciding that today won't be the day humanity goes extinct. Not if they have anything to say about it. Is there a path to victory? To actually defeating chaos, the Tyranids, the Necrons, and every other threat simultaneously? No, probably not. The mathematics don't work. The resources aren't there. The strategic position is untenable. But is there a path to surviving another millennium? Maybe. If Guilliman can reform the Imperium, if the Primaris Marines prove as effective as hoped, if the psychic awakening provides more benefits than costs, if the alliances with Ealdari hold, if the Necron dynasties stay fragmented, if the Tyranids can be slowed, if the Tau don't become too powerful, if. Too many variables, too many things that have to go right, too many ways it can all fall apart. And yet the Imperium still stands, still fights, still refuses to surrender. That's not hope, not really. Hope implies belief in improvement, faith that tomorrow will be better than today. The Imperium doesn't have that, can't have that, because tomorrow will almost certainly be worse. What the Imperium has instead is will. The determination to face tomorrow anyway. To fight even when fighting is futile. To stand even when standing is suicidal. To exist out of pure, stubborn refusal to stop existing. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But war means both sides are still fighting. War means neither side has won. War means that for all the horror, for all the suffering, for all the grinding darkness, the fight continues. And as long as the fight continues, maybe that's enough. Maybe that's what passes for hope in a universe that's forgotten what real hope looks like. The Emperor protects through war and faith, through Guilliman's strategies and the Primaris Marines, through Inquisitors and Guardsmen and Space Marines, through 1 billion daily sacrifices that no one remembers and no one thanks. The Emperor protects, even if protection just means surviving until tomorrow. Even if tomorrow brings nothing but more war. Even if the price is everything that makes us human. The Imperium endures, not because it should, not because it deserves to, but because surrender is unthinkable. And that, in the 42nd millennium, is the only form of hope that matters. So, we've completed the journey. 60 million years compressed into 5 parts, from the war in heaven to the age of the Dark Imperium, from ancient god wars that broke reality itself to the current struggle, just to survive another day. We've seen empires rise to unimaginable heights and fall to depths equally profound. We've watched species evolve and devolve. We've traced humanity's arc from primitive origins through a golden age, into a dark age, into a period of relative stability, into another golden age, and then into 10,000 years of managed decline, culminating in the galaxy literally splitting in half. And through it all, one constant: war. War against the Necrons, war against the Old Ones, war against the Eldari Empire at its height, war during the Great Crusade, the heresy, the scouring. 10,000 years of continuous conflict on a million fronts. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the Indomitus Crusade. War, eternal, unchanging. The only constant in a universe where everything else is in flux. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. Not because anyone wants it, not because it's glorious or honorable or meaningful, but because peace is impossible. Because every species in the galaxy is competing for the same resources. Because chaos exists and feeds on conflict. Because the Tyranids are coming and they'll consume everything. Because the Necrons want their galaxy back, and humanity happens to be living in it. War because the alternative is extinction. And the Imperium, for all its flaws, for all its horrors, for all the ways it betrays everything the Emperor claimed to stand for, keeps humanity alive, barely, inefficiently, at catastrophic cost, but alive. That's the tragedy and the triumph of Warhammer 40,000. The Imperium is the worst government imaginable, except for all the alternatives, which are worse. It's oppressive, but chaos offers only damnation. It's brutal, but the Tyranids offer only consumption. It's stagnant, but innovation led to the Men of Iron and near extinction. It's theocratic, but faith is the only weapon against chaos that works. Every terrible aspect of the Imperium exists because the alternative proved worse. Every compromise was necessary. Every atrocity was justified. Every sacrifice was required. Until you're left with an empire that survives through mechanisms that would horrify anyone who actually thought about them. But thinking about them is dangerous. Questioning is heresy. Doubt leads to chaos. So the Imperium grinds forward, not toward victory. There is no victory. Not toward peace. There is no peace. Just forward. One more day, one more battle, one more compromise that costs a little more humanity in exchange for a little more survival. Is it worth it? That's a question the Imperium doesn't allow itself to ask. Because if the answer is no, then 10,000 years of suffering has been for nothing. And that's not something human consciousness can bear. So the answer has to be yes. Has to be. Otherwise, why continue? Why fight? Why not just surrender and let it all end? The Imperium survives because surrender is unthinkable. Because the alternative to struggling forward is lying down and dying. And humans, for all our flaws, are very bad at accepting death gracefully. We fight, we struggle, we sacrifice, we suffer, we endure. And in the 42nd millennium, that has to be enough, because it's all we have left. Thank you for staying with me through this journey, through the deep time of the war in heaven, through humanity's rise and fall, and rise and fall, through the heresy that broke everything, through 10,000 years of decline, through the moment when the sky tore open and the galaxy learned what true darkness meant. We've covered the timeline, the structure, the factions, the forces that move in the grim darkness. This is Warhammer 40,000. This is the universe where hope went to die and was replaced by spite, where heroes are weapons and weapons are all that matters, where the only good ending is surviving long enough to see tomorrow's horror. It's bleak, oppressive, deliberately, consciously, fundamentally hostile to everything optimistic about science fiction. And yet, there's something compelling about a species that refuses to die, about characters who keep fighting despite knowing they'll lose, about a universe so hostile that mere survival becomes heroic. The Imperium will probably fall. Eventually. The Tyranids will probably win. Or chaos. Or the Necrons. Or humanity will tear itself apart from within. But not today. Not while there's one more battle to fight. One more enemy to face. One more day to survive. The Emperor protects. Or he doesn't. Either way, humanity fights on. Because that's all there is left to do. If you're still here, maybe start the next episode. Or just let the quiet take you. And if you've already drifted off, that's all right. Good night, traveler. Sleep well beneath the stars.